Hey heroes, welcome to another terrifying episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins in the United Kingdom in the early 20th century. John Falsworth and his brother James Montgomery were born and raised at their family manor in Dimhurst, England. The Falsworths were a family who had some familiarity with the occult, having befriended the supernaturally immortal adventurer Mortigan Goth. Otherwise known as Immortalis, Goth was born in the 14th century but won eternal life in a game of chess with the devil Mephisto. Having seen supernatural things already, young John became convinced that the title character of the novel Dracula really existed. And indeed, as we already discussed in my video about vampires in general, the author, Bram Stoker, based his book on a journal written by Dracula himself. In early 1914, when their father William passed away, Montgomery, as the older son, inherited the title of Lord Falsworth and most of the family estate. Bitter and jealous, John then sought out Dracula's castle in Transylvania, intent on enslaving the vampire lord and using his power for his own ends. However, Falsworth underestimated Dracula, who easily mesmerized the young man into dropping the cross he'd brought with him. And so it was John who became a servant of Dracula after being transformed into a vampire himself. Furthermore, John Falsworth had come from the same country as Jonathan Harker, a man who clashed with Dracula and nearly killed him in 1890, as described in Stoker's novel. And so, as a form of revenge, the vampire lord sent John back to England to cause chaos and destruction. Those who knew him were unaware of his fate, but soon had other concerns as the First World War was breaking out across the continent. John's brother Montgomery became a masked operative for the British government known as Union Jack. John, on the other hand, allied himself with German intelligence, who gave him his eerie costume, as well as the code name Baron Blood. According to some reports, the Baron's activities were investigated by his brother's superhero group, Freedom's 5, but he always slipped from their grasp. Then in 1918, John was sent to London to prey on high-ranking government and military officials. Summoned back from the front lines by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Union Jack was dispatched to end the vampiric menace. After 5 nights of searching, the two clashed for the first time atop Tower Bridge, and John recognized his brother's voice. John stayed silent to keep his own identity a secret, although he did let out an inhuman shriek when Montgomery stabbed him with a silver dagger. Injured, Baron Blood escaped and went into hiding, where he spent the next several years studying arcane knowledge. After the war, Union Jack was retired, and Montgomery had 2 children, Brian and Jacqueline. But then, with Adolf Hitler's rise to power, John returned to Germany and allied himself with the Nazis. He sometimes converted other Nazis into vampires as well, so that they would do his bidding, one of which was a man named Helmut von Schuler. In order to better use him as an undercover operative, Nazi scientists endowed Baron Blood with the ability to resist the negative effects of sunlight for brief periods, but doing so reduced his vampiric shape-shifting abilities. And so when he returned to his family manor, he had to wear oversized false teeth to conceal his fangs. Because he had not aged in over 2 decades, he claimed to be his own son, John Falsworth Jr. In 1940, he vampirized a visiting distant cousin, Catherine Ainsley Jones, a woman who was in love with the previously mentioned immortal Mortigan Goth. She attempted to feed on Mortigan, but his immortal blood suppressed her vampiric nature, and Catherine left the manor without revealing her cousin's secret. John then spent more time outside of England, but returned in 1942. During that time, the predominantly American superhero team, the Invaders, were stationed in London. And so when Baron Blood attempted to feed on his niece, Jacqueline, he was chased off by the Human Torch. That would be the original android Human Torch, Jim Hammond, not the one that's a member of the Fantastic Four. Hammond and the Invaders then accompanied Jacqueline back to Falsworth Manor, where a retired Montgomery told them about his previous encounter with Baron Blood. Despite his age, he also donned his costume once again to help the younger heroes hunt his old foe. And sure enough, Union Jack ended up saving the Invaders from Baron Blood, blinding the vampire with silver powder. However, upon returning home, Montgomery found that his daughter had been bitten while he was out. As a result, it wasn't long before the Baron's true identity was discovered, but after he regained his eyesight, John attempted to abduct Jacqueline and finish what he started. In the ensuing battle within a rocky cave, Baron Blood crushed Union Jack's legs with a boulder, crippling him. While Blood was then occupied battling the Invaders, Montgomery used a piece of stone as a lever to roll the large rock off of himself. Acting quickly, Captain America grabbed Jacqueline and pushed Baron Blood into the rolling boulder's path. As a result, the Nazi vampire was knocked onto a sharp stalagmite and impaled, reducing him to a skeleton. After that, doctors attempted to treat Jacqueline, but the vampire ichor in her bloodstream rendered her incompatible with any known blood type. In a desperate gamble, she received a transfusion using the Human Torch's synthetic typeless blood. Not only did this trigger a latent regenerative power, possibly mutant in nature, but the unique combination of circumstances endowed Jacqueline with super speed. She used her new power to become the costume superhero Spitfire and fought alongside the Invaders. Meanwhile, her superpowered brother, Brian, had been fighting as the Destroyer, an identity that he shared with American reporter Keen Marlowe, which is a whole other story. The important thing for today is that Brian Falsworth subsequently followed in his father's footsteps to become the second Union Jack. The Destroyer identity was subsequently adopted by a man named Roger Aubrey, who was secretly in a relationship with Brian Falsworth. But back to the story at hand, Brian and Jacqueline later found Japanese soldiers attempting to revive Baron Blood. The siblings intervened as Union Jack and Spitfire, but in the ensuing battle, Brian inadvertently destroyed the rock holding the vampire's skeleton in place. That was enough for Baron Blood to be restored, and the Nazi vampire escaped with the enemy combatants. He was brought to Chinatown in New York City, where he met an Asian woman with psychic abilities, Lady Lotus. Born in Japan but living in the United States, Lotus swore revenge against America after witnessing other Japanese Americans being ushered away to internment camps. She avoided that fate for herself by passing for Chinese, a ruse made easier by her hypnotic powers. Her abilities also allowed her to recruit a team of Nazi supervillains including Masterman, Warrior Woman, U-Man, and of course, Baron Blood. Collectively known as the Super Axis, this foursome battled the Invaders when the heroes returned to the United States. That time, Baron Blood was defeated by Namor, the Sub-Mariner, who impaled him with a wooden spike. Although Falsworth later had revenge when he seduced and vampirized Siobhan McDermott, an Irish woman who Namor was wooing. The Sub-Mariner attempted to finish Baron Blood by breaking his neck, but the vampire quickly recovered. He returned to Nazi Germany and served the Reich by attempting to turn captured Allied soldiers into undead pawns. He vampirized a colonel named William Pupreets and intended on doing the same to Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. However, when blood was called back to London, Pupreets turned on his Nazi captors. He used his vampiric strength to force open the bunker doors, allowing the Howlers to go free, and exposing himself to the sun's rays in the process. Baron Blood continued to clash with the Invaders during the war, with there likely being many more encounters that have yet to be documented. In January of 1945, he and other supervillains defended Nazi scientist Arnim Zola while he developed a biological weapon in the Netherlands. However, at some point the Nazis began to fear that the British vampire couldn't be trusted. They tasked an imprisoned Polish scientist, Leo Jacobson, with finding a cure for Blood's vampirism, but nothing they attempted worked. They did determine that drinking the blood of the Baron himself sometimes cured his victims, but this was unreliable and sometimes resulted in the victim's death instead. Fortunately, it did allow Captain America to recover after he was bitten by Blood. Sometime later in 1945, Baron Blood defected and returned to the United States alongside his true master, Dracula. At the Ravencroft Institute, he oversaw inhumane experiments that were conducted with the intent of freeing vampires from their common weaknesses, but often transformed the subjects into something worse. These experiments were largely conducted by the Weapon Plus program's Truett Hudson, better known by his alias Professor Thornton. He would later be one of the men primarily responsible for the procedure that coated Wolverine's skeleton in solid adamantium. But the experiments at Ravencroft were interrupted by Captain America and Bucky. When the asylum's founder, Jonas Ravencroft, released the misshapen monsters created by Thornton, Count Dracula and Baron Blood fled. After the Second World War, Jacqueline and Brian Falsworth, along with Brian's best friend and secret lover, Roger Aubrey, helped hunt down escaped Nazi war criminals with the Wild Pack, a Simkarian fighting force led by Ernst Sablinova, father of the modern-day Silver Sable. While the Invaders were reformed into the All-Winners Squad, a name chosen by President Truman, Roger Aubrey, as the Destroyer, decided to assemble a more international team. In 1951, he christened this new squad the V Battalion, named after a group who fought against the Nazis that were occupying France during the war. This V Battalion operated out of a castle in Simcaria, and for a time, Jacqueline and Brian served as active members. However, in 1953, Brian died in a car accident and a grieving Jacqueline retired. During this time, she was comforted by her new boyfriend, Cedric Crichton, and the two married a few years later. Meanwhile, Baron Blood befriended another Nazi supervillain, Werner Schmidt, aka Brain Drain. In 1959, that pair re-emerged and clashed with a team of Avengers led by Nick Fury, which also included Ernst Sablinova. During that conflict, Baron Blood was defeated by a wooden spear with a silver tip thrown by Kraven the Hunter. Whether it was in the aftermath of that incident or some subsequent conflict, Baron Blood's remains were eventually returned to Britain. Despite his ignominious life and Montgomery's requests that he be completely destroyed, there was still contention about what to do with his body due to his noble heritage. Since a consensus could not be reached, Baron Blood was sealed within the Tower of London, surrounded by garlic and religious iconography, with a wooden stake driven into his heart. There he remained as time rolled on and the Marvel Age of Heroes approached. Relatively late in their marriage, Jacqueline and her husband had a son together, Kenneth Crichton. After his father passed away, Kenneth attended the Manchester School of Art, where he became close friends with a strong, athletic man named Joseph Chapman. Meanwhile, Dracula discovered the location of Baron Blood's remains and dispatched a human servant, Dr. Jacob Charles Cromwell, to revive him. Cromwell retrieved the Baron's body, replacing it with the skeletal remains of an unidentified woman. The vampire was resurrected once again, and while he regained the ability to shapeshift after spending so much time dead, his resistance to the sun's rays was greatly diminished. He stayed with Cromwell and his two daughters, Charlotte and Lily, and forced them to relocate to Dimhurst, not far from the Falsworth family home. He learned that his brother was still alive and decided to wait until Montgomery was completely enfeebled before trying to vampirize him so that he would be weak and decrepit for all eternity. In the meantime, Baron Blood tried to stealthily feed on the locals, but was soon spotted returning to the Cromwell residence. Angry villagers who saw this set the home ablaze, not knowing that Lily and Charlotte were inside. Cromwell himself rushed into the burning building to try and save his daughters, but Baron Blood hatched a plan to escape and killed both Cromwell and Charlotte. Lily, on the other hand, was bitten, beginning the process of transforming her into a vampire. Disguising himself as Jacob Cromwell, Baron Blood ran outside, carrying what appeared to be Lily's burned corpse. After that, Blood continued impersonating Cromwell, using a mask and bodysuit to help him resist the sunlight at the same time. For a while, he tried to be sneaky with his feeding habits, using his position as a doctor to mesmerize his patients and only drain a little at a time. He eventually succumbed to his bloodlust and started attacking and draining random victims, but even then he made sure to break and mutilate their neck, both to conceal the bite marks and to ensure they didn't rise as vampires themselves. While most attributed this to a human serial killer they dubbed the Slasher, Montgomery Falsworth suspected the truth and called in Captain America for help. Cap soon discovered that Blood's remains had been switched out of the Tower of London and had an encounter with a vampire at the Falsworth estate. After that, Kenneth Crichton and Joe Chapman suspected the truth about Dr. Cromwell after finding bite marks on the neck of Ken's girlfriend, Jenny Wilson, who was one of Cromwell's patients. Meanwhile, Montgomery donned his old Union Jack uniform, intending on luring the Baron out so that he could be defeated once and for all. A plan was quickly concocted, and Dr. Cromwell was summoned to treat the aging superhero. However, when Baron Blood revealed himself, Union Jack leapt out of bed and attacked. Captain America joined the fray as well, ultimately beheading the vampire with his shield. Union Jack unmasked, and for the first time it wasn't a member of the Falsworth family, but Ken's friend, Joe Chapman. After that, Baron Blood's body was burned, seemingly ending his accursed existence once and for all. James Montgomery Falsworth, the original Union Jack, held on long enough to see that happen before finally passing away. However, Baron Blood's legacy would live on in the shadows as Lily Cromwell dubbed herself the Baroness and founded a cult in his honor. At some point, she met a man named Axel Nacht, who offered her a place in the neo-Nazi terrorist group Axis Mundi, but only if she offered a sacrifice to prove her loyalty. In the meantime, following his grandfather's death, Kenneth had no interest in continuing his legacy, and insisted that Joseph carry on as the third Union Jack. In a subsequent adventure, Joe helped an aging Jacqueline rescue Namor and the Human Torch from neo-Nazis who had revived Masterman and Warrior Woman. In that battle, Jacqueline was shot and lost a lot of blood, but the Human Torch provided her with another transfusion. This time it had the effect of restoring Jacqueline to her physical prime, albeit while keeping her white hair. That ended up being a strange situation for Kenneth, who was now physically older than his own mother. He was also briefly abducted by the ancient mutant Celine Gallio, who wished to study Jacqueline's blood. Fortunately, his mother rescued him as Spitfire and avoided becoming a lab rat. Sometime after that, Catherine Ainsley Jones, the woman infected by Baron Blood in 1940, returned, having vampirized a group of children to do her bidding. She attempted to feed on Spitfire, but the synthetic torch blood in her system proved to be fatal for Catherine. Dr. Strange then dealt with the vampire kids by beheading them. Speaking of Strange, during this time, the name Baron Blood was used by his vampiric brother, Victor. Victor was given the name in costume by the voodoo priestess Marie Laveau, but that's another story entirely. He briefly changed his name to Chiron, but ultimately chose to stake his own heart rather than risk hurting innocent people. And the reason that Victor abandoned the name Baron Blood is because the original Nazi returned once again. This time he was resurrected by a man named Ormond Witchwood from Mystech, a sinister organization dedicated to world domination through bio-occult research. Although his remains were mostly destroyed, Witchwood was able to restore him with arcane magic as part of a larger plot to summon a being known as the Red Lord. Blood was tasked with hunting human sacrifices, killing them after dressing them up like Union Jack. However, he was defeated and seemingly destroyed once more, this time by Joe Chapman. He eventually revived yet again, but was subsequently imprisoned in the supervillain holding facility, the Raft. Meanwhile, things weren't going well for Kenneth Crichton, who was diagnosed with anemia. He started to grow bitter, resenting both his mother for her new lease on life and Joseph for his success as Union Jack. Then one day he was approached by the Baroness, Lily Cromwell, who decided to take advantage of his mental state. She seduced, infected, and even slept with Kenneth, transforming him into the next Baron Blood. She then employed him in her search for the Holy Grail, a mystical cup allegedly used by Jesus Christ himself. Learning that the Grail could be used to render a vampire immune to sunlight, the Baroness dispatched Kenneth to retrieve it. This of course led to a confrontation between Union Jack and the new Baron Blood. In the end, the Baroness succeeded in drinking from the Grail, ridding herself of typical vampire weaknesses and becoming more powerful than ever. However, she then betrayed her followers, crushing the artifact as the sun rose, and allowing many of them to be wiped out. That included Kenneth Crichton, son of Spitfire and grandson of the original Union Jack, who turned to dust in his best friend's arms. However, the Baroness had already used him for one more purpose and was left pregnant with his child. Furthermore, killing her followers proved to be sufficient sacrifice to be inducted into Axis Mundi, the covert terrorist network dedicated to the resurgence of the Third Reich. She thus dubbed herself Baroness Blood, fully indulging in the Nazi ideology. When her son was born, she named him John after the original Baron Blood. However, the baby vampire had inherited his father's anemia, requiring him to feed on his own bloodline to survive. Using hypnotism to impersonate Kenneth, the Baroness abducted Jacqueline so that her son could feed off of her. Fortunately, Spitfire was saved by the arrival of Union Jack, 2 Human Torches, and her old ally Roger Aubrey, the Destroyer. While she was captured, many of the other vampires had also attempted to feed off of Spitfire, and while they didn't have the immediate reaction that Catherine did, the presence of her synthetic blood in their system allowed the original torch to quickly ignite them simultaneously. However, Baroness Blood escaped with the baby John Crichton and later joined a group of vampires called the Legion of the Unliving under Dracula's son, the Shadow Colonel. In the meantime, the original Baron Blood resurfaced again, illegitimately claiming the title of Lord Falsworth. During this time, he sought to taunt the artificially created vampire Michael Morbius by resurrecting his old friend and first victim, Emil Nikos, as a true vampire. And after that, the vampire hunter Blade and his father, Lucas Cross, were tricked into fulfilling a prophecy that caused every vampire on Earth to be resurrected. As a side effect, Jacqueline manifested latent vampiric traits that were dormant since being bitten by Baron Blood during World War II. Fortunately, she was able to control her bloodthirst and also lacked typical vampiric weaknesses, making her less like a regular vampire and more like Blade. Speaking of which, her new form caused her to clash with Blade, but the two later started dating when they realized how much they had in common. Meanwhile, a resurrected Kenneth Crichton joined forces with Dracula, who sought to conquer Britain. Kenneth was dispatched to recruit his mother into Dracula's vampiric army. Jacqueline resisted Dracula's mental manipulations but feigned compliance until the moment was right to strike. In the end, the vampire invasion was repelled and Kenneth surrendered to his old friend Joseph. However, Jacqueline had already asked Blade to kill her son, a task that he happily carried out. As for the original Baron Blood, John Falsworth, he has continued to ally himself with fascist forces like Baron Zemo and Hydra. While battling Sam Wilson, who at the time was operating as Captain America, Baron Blood fed on Redwing, a falcon that Sam shared a telepathic link with. Fortunately, vampirism affects birds differently than humans, and Redwing was spared most of the ill effects. Of course, Baron Blood is a tenacious foe, so it's only a matter of time before we see more from the sinister Nazi vampire. But that's all I've got for you guys this week. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!